Hi, everyone. My name is Bhaskar Sunkara, and I'm the editor of Jacobin. It's my great pleasure to moderate this panel for a recent book by Eric Blanc, who's a longtime socialist organizer. He's a frequent contributor to publications like Jacobin. He's the author of Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave, and Working Class Politics, which came out in 2019 from Verso. And now, of course, he's the author of Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire, 1882 to 1917, which is out now from Haymarket and, of course, brought to life thanks to the incredible work of Historical Materialism. And, of course, Historical Materialism is hosting us today. And, it's really been incredibly vital to keeping alive Marxist and developing Marxist intellectual thought in our generation. It's an incredibly valuable resource through its conferences, journal, and of course through its book series. And I should say, before I pass it off to Eric, that what I've always really appreciated about Eric's work is that he's someone who embodies political commitment, which I mean in the best sense. It's steady, it's unflinching, it's unchanging in the best way possible, but also he combines that with genuine intellectual curiosity and a willing to challenge himself and others and look for new perspectives. And I think that Revolutionary Social Democracy is a work that really embodies that. Of course, it's written by a socialist activist who has a very apparent belief in socialism and interest in not just studying these from a distance, but learning history in order to influence the struggle for socialism today. But it's a very broad study of the theory and strategy of revolutionaries across the Russian Empire, debates that took place that go far beyond accounts that merely center debates between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks in Petrograd and Moscow between 1905 and 1917. And obviously lots of very important work centers in those places and on those years. But I think that Eric, to his credit, is trying to broaden the debate and discussion. And he chose a quite difficult road doing that, because the Russian Empire spans a couple continents and lots of different languages and many different debates. So it's a very ambitious project, especially for someone who is engaged in field research and lots of other work on completely, or not completely, but somewhat disconnected topics. So I want to really encourage you to buy the book in paperback. I will send a link in the chat shortly that allows you to buy the book in paperback at a pretty significant discount. So please do support this work. It's incredibly valuable. And I'm going to let Eric go ahead and give an overview of the main arguments and takeaways of Revolutionary Social Democracy now for around 15 minutes. Then we'll have comments and questions from Meagan Day, who is the co-author of Bigger Than Bernie and a staff writer at Jacobin, and as well as Lars Lih, who, among other titles, is the author of Lenin Rediscovered. And of course, if you are a fan of historical materialism, you definitely know of his work. And then I may have some questions of my own for Eric. Then we'll let Eric reply. We will hopefully solicit some of the questions from the audience, and we'll have a bit of a free-flowing conversation for the rest of the hour. But without further ado, why don't you go ahead, Eric?
Great, thanks, Bhaskar. I'm gonna share my screen. Thanks to everyone who came out, and thanks for Meagan and Lars and the HM folks for making this happen. It's been a long project, and it feels really good to finally have it out there. What I want to do briefly is talk about the big takeaways of the book, both for political reasons and analytically. Before I do that, I'll just briefly explain how I got into this, because it's not self-evident. About 12 years ago, I was, like many other activists before the Bernie moment, deeply enmeshed in trying to learn lessons from the Russian Revolution. And it sort of stumbled, it became clear to me that we rarely talked about what happened outside of Central Russia, St. Petersburg, Moscow. And so I started reading everything I could in English, because it seemed to me almost like writing about the Russian Revolution. It would be the equivalent of writing around the United States without talking about Black people, for instance. If you didn't talk about the fact that the vast majority of people in the Russian Empire were not of the dominant nationality. And so I'm going to pull up this tidy little screen. You can see that actually Russians were a minority of the population. And so that got me thinking, well, what the hell happened outside of the center of the empire? And what might that tell us about revolutionary politics in general and the Russian Revolution specifically? And the long and short of it is I read everything I could in English, and I still didn't really know what had happened. There's some stuff written, but not that much. Overwhelmingly, the literature focuses on Central Russia. And somewhat naively, I got in my head that I could write the book on the Russian Revolution from an empire-wide perspective. And because I'm good at languages, and I was working a graveyard shift, and I had some free time. And the short version then is that it took me another 10 years to finish it, and it's finally out, and I'm very excited about it. I think it's relevant for activists. I think it's also relevant, I think, for some academic debates that are going on. And what I want to do is, in this presentation, very briefly sketch out what I think the big takeaways are. The book is kind of an amalgam of political sociology, history, and an intervention into left debates. And I'm going to take those themes in order. The sociological side of things, the comparison I really dig into, one of the central ones is Finland versus the rest of the empire, because you have a great test case where Finland was the one part of the empire where the Socialist Party was parliamentary focused. It had a very strong organization. Imagine something like the German social democracy, for those of you who know it. Deep cultural activities, infrastructure, newspapers, sort of a working class subculture, and had very cautious tactics. And on the rest of the empire, in contrast, you had radical parties that were oriented towards armed uprising, sort of insurrection. They had much weaker, more fluid organizations, and they were much more focused on mass action tactics, strikes in particular. And the explanation then for this consistent divergence across the empire was basically that Finland had political freedom and a form of parliamentary rule, unlike the rest of the empire. And so it was pretty understandable why the form of political organization in that context took a dramatically different turn than in the rest of the empire, where socialists were forced to work in underground conditions. And that is one of the comparisons that I draw out to try to reach some broader political and analytical conclusions. The second sociological comparison that centers the book is comparing the 1905 and 1917-18 outcomes of the revolution. The short version is that in 1905, radicalism was hegemonic, was prevalent almost in all places, except for Finland and Armenia. And under Marxist leadership, workers and peasants actually took power locally in most of the empire, not on the empire as a whole, but on a local level. And the political content of those regimes they set up locally and the dual power regimes that they established were not just anti-autocratic, they were anti-capitalist, very consciously excluded liberals, and were not aiming towards sort of giving power to the liberal parties or the capitalist class politically for the foreseeable future. In 1917-18, actually, the dynamic shifts considerably. Moderate socialism, by which I mean socialism oriented strategically to a bloc with liberals and to passing off political power to representatives of the bourgeoisie, that became much more widespread. And so you had anti-capitalist revolutions much more unevenly now. You had that in Central Russia, places like Estonia, Latvia, as well as Finland. But key regions that had been radical before now had a much more moderate cross-class outcome. And that's most importantly in Poland and Ukraine, which were the two most strategic parts of the empire for geopolitical reasons and for political reasons outside of Central Russia. These were seen as the gateways to the West for spreading the revolution, and the defeat in these two regions in particular needs to be explained. And the book tries to make a case that a necessary causal factor for explaining the divergence in outcomes between 1905 and 1917-18 is the evolution and political competition between political parties. I don't argue that it's sufficient. It's not the only reason this happened, but it's a central reason for the divergent outcomes in these revolutions that had hugely consequential impact, as we'll see, for the course of world history, certainly for the course of European history. That leads me to the final kind of sociological takeaway, which is that parties are central to class formation. And that might seem maybe obvious if you're, or self-evident for many of my activist friends who are on this call, but it's actually quite controversial in the literature, and particularly in literatures on revolutions and comparative revolutions. And I would just say that more generally, if you think about it, it's not very widely accepted that parties are central to workers seeing themselves as a class. To give just an example of this, the way most leftists today, and certainly broader society, looks at this type of history is that presumably there was something 100 years ago that was in the water or in the class structure that made it so that you could have mass socialist movements. There was something maybe about the prevalence of big factories or industrialization or various theories about different types of structures that no longer are in place, and therefore you wouldn't expect and shouldn't expect class politics as a mass formation to reemerge in our current conditions for structural reasons. And I do think that there's been tremendous shifts and consequential shifts in capitalist social relations over the last century. It'd be silly to ignore that. But what the dominant interpretation of sort of political trajectory of the workers' movement and what we should be doing today misses is that even 100 years ago, it took an incredible amount of work from political activists and political parties as a whole to help millions of workers see themselves and act as a class. And that wasn't an automatic process back then in relationship, in response to class exploitation. And it means that there's no reason to expect that you would see a similar emergence spontaneously of class consciousness and organization today in the absence of political parties pushing in that direction. And so a lot of what the book does is it digs into what did it actually look like? How did these parties help wage earners see themselves as a collective with shared interests and a force that could not only win democracy, but overturn capitalism on an international scale. And for time reasons, I won't be able to dig into all of that in this presentation, but briefly, the things that the socialists of the time focused on and were very excited about, I think are things that we as activists today also might consider getting more excited about, because it's not necessarily the thing that is always focused on. Really central were the fight to build class organization and class consciousness, to root socialists in the working class, to unite workers in their organizations. They were obsessed with how to build workers' unity. This was like an overarching thing that they tried to figure out, and the book shows how they learned through experience different ways to do that. The fight for working class hegemony, that workers should lead a fight of the opposition in society against anti-democratic rule and ultimately against capitalism, that they shouldn't isolate themselves, but that they should fight so that liberal forces would not take either hegemony in society as a whole or in the opposition movement. And then finally, to make all that happen, socialists had to confront a lot of really hard choices and political dilemmas. They had to learn through experience. And to me, one of the fun things about the book is you really see activists and political parties adjusting to unexpected developments in political life. You see them really trying to grapple with the tension between their theory and their practice, and being willing to evolve when the conditions merited it. And that, I think, is sort of methodologically and strategically quite important, because that gets lost oftentimes when people think that there's some sort of formula for socialist politics. Okay, moving on. I'm gonna have to breeze through the historical takeaways. As I mentioned, it's a historical book as well. If you're a history nerd, you will like this a lot. There's, I'll just say now, the majority of socialists in the empire were not Russian. 75% of the social democrats in the empire, according to my statistics that I compiled, and you can see a bit in this list, were from the non-Russian parties. The Finnish Social Democracy on its own was the biggest party per capita in the whole world. So we're talking about really massive parties that have been largely overlooked in the literature, and to the detriment, I think, of our understanding of the history, and certainly of the socialist politics in general. The second big takeaway historically is the book helps try to explain why the most significant assault against capitalist rule on an international level failed, which is to say that after World War I and the Russian Revolution, there really was a sense that this might be the moment where capitalism is overthrown, not just in Russia, but in numerous countries in the West, particularly in Austria, Hungary, and Germany. And this is, for socialists, really the turning point that didn't turn. And there's a lot of books about the German Revolution, and I don't want to discount that. But the thing that is often missed is that since at least 1905, revolutionary social democrats, and by that means the left wing of the Second International, including the Bolsheviks, and Kautsky and the rest, all of them were oriented to a conception of spreading the Russian Revolution westwards via the borderlands of the empire. So if you look at this map, you can see that Poland and Ukraine are adjacent to both Germany and Austria-Hungary. And not just are they adjacent, but the German and Austrian empires themselves ruled over these nationalities. They ruled over parts of Poland and parts of Ukraine, which have been split up. And so the conception was, we're going to have a revolution in Russia spread through Poland and Ukraine in particular to the West. And explaining why that didn't happen is therefore really important for understanding not only the defeat of the revolution in Austria, at least the defeat of the socialist revolution in Austria and Germany, but also the repercussions that had for the crystallization of Stalinist authoritarianism in Central Russia. And the puzzle, again, as I mentioned before, is that Poland and Ukraine, like most of the borderlands, were actually, for much of this period, more radical than Central Russia. These were places where the 1905 revolution went furthest, in which you had some of the most radical parties. So it's not self-evident that this should have been a barrier as opposed to a bridge for international revolution. And then to move towards the political takeaways, I think the big point is that Bolsheviks weren't that exceptional. And that's an important point because the founding myth of Leninism politically for over a century now has been based on two myths about Bolshevik exceptionism. And briefly, these are that the Bolsheviks broke from Kautskyism, sort of the dominant, what was referred to as the dominant politics of the Second International. I don't think it's a helpful term, but the idea is that they broke from the Second International Kautskyist idea of state and revolution, and that made possible the October Revolution. Instead of the old parliamentarist road, they had a new dual power road in which you would smash the whole old state and replace it with workers' councils. And the second big innovation, supposedly, was that they broke from Kautskyism on the Revolutionary Party. Instead of having a broad party, they would have a party just for the real revolutionaries, no opportunists involved. And then that also, we're told, was necessary for the October Revolution. And then Leninism as a strategy really was based on trying to export this type of strategy that they said was the lessons of Russia to the rest of the world. And that's really the founding myth of Leninism, that the Bolsheviks, through their exceptional break from Second International Socialism, demonstrated the relevance of a new vision of state and revolution and a new type of revolutionary party. And the problem with this is that is wrong, and it's wrong for a couple different reasons. Actually, I'll keep on the first this slide before finalizing. The basic problem is that if you look at the empire as a whole, it becomes clear that actually the Bolsheviks had literally nothing exceptional about them, that in the sense that all of their major strategic or organizational things that differentiated them from the German or Western parties were due not to a theoretical break, but to a practical consequence of being organizing under an autocracy. And Lars, who's on this panel, really pioneered this understanding of the Bolsheviks and Lenin didn't break from Kautsky, but in fact implemented this orientation of revolutionary social democracy up through the October Revolution. And what I show in this book is that, sure enough, when you look at the empire as a whole, all of the underground parties that tried to implement revolutionary social democratic policies that were very much oriented towards implementing Kautsky's theory, they shared the orientation of the Bolsheviks, and they took power with them across the empire in 1917. So there was no exception, there was no break. And moreover, it doesn't make any sense really to extrapolate lessons from the context of an autocracy and a post-autocratic state, because there was no capitalist state or parliamentary democracy in Russia to overcome. And so therefore, trying to say that this experience could be a lesson for political democracies in the West is just really faulty logic with huge consequences for the international left for the next century, because to a large extent, we've lived in that shadow. So this is the final kind of big takeaway. I would argue that the book itself tries to show that for the regime type, there's relevant and non-relevant types of Marxist politics. Very briefly put, for an autocracy, the insurrectionary dual power, insurgent strike-based approach of the Bolsheviks and other underground socialists made sense. In turn, for low inclusion parliamentary regimes, and that's a thing like Finland or Germany, the type of approach articulated by Kautsky and not implemented in Germany for various reasons, but that was implemented in Finland, made sense, in which you would accumulate organizational power, have a very intransigent stance against the state, keep foregrounding the fight for the final socialist goal. And that made sense there because there was parliamentary rule and political freedom, but the parliament itself was extremely limited in what it could do. So this is like the least democratic of the democracies. You could think about it that way. So there was not actually much reason to, or space to try to work to make parliamentary compromises, to pass transformative reforms because of the nature, the restricted nature of that parliamentary regime. And this is where we're saying that because some people are really into Kautsky now and we're like, we should just do Kautsky everywhere. It's like, well, the context of today is actually quite different than Germany or Finland because we aren't in the extent of actual democracy, formal democracy is more significant. So that I'll just leave on this final point is that for capitalist democracies, in places where you have political freedom and you have genuine parliaments with some ability to pass transformative reforms, it's much harder strategically to either do what they did in the Bolsheviks. That's not going to be relevant. Even to a significant extent, what the Finnish and German left articulated also is going to have limitations. It will be similar, I think, and this is what the book tries to suggest, insofar as that you have a parliamentary regime, the natural inclination of workers is going to use that instrument to advance their interests and to not try to displace that with some sort of new form of workers' councils. But what makes it different in a capitalist democracy compared to like Finland or Germany is that there's more space to push for transformative reforms in the short term. So you can't just be isolationist from it. You have to intervene in the state to democratize it, to build up workers' power. And that makes it is much trickier because the threat of co-optation is much harder, but there's no other way we've seen so far to start getting towards the type of mass workers movement that would have the power to take on and overcome capitalism in a capitalist democracy. But I think that's ultimately maybe one of the big takeaways is that there's still a question mark. We don't have a formula for how to get beyond social democracy yet. And that I think should not be discouraging, but should be impetus for us to take very seriously a methodology of open-endedness, of inquisitiveness, of trying to learn through class struggle and avoiding formulas at the same time as we learn from history so that we can try to avoid making the same mistakes from the past. So that is the, in short, version of the book. And I'm looking forward to the discussion with everybody else.
All right, so I suppose we should turn now to Meagan. I think Meagan will go first, then Lars, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much, Eric, and thanks for having me on and sending me a copy of the book, which was really a pleasure to read. I guess I want to talk about what some of the main takeaways that I got from why this book is necessary are, and to do that, I'll retread some of the same ground that you just covered, but then I'll also get to something that you didn't touch on that I really want to discuss. So first things first, if I understand correctly, there are several political implications of ignoring borderland Marxists in the Russian Empire. The first is that without them, we can't really understand how bourgeois forces gained the upper hand after 1917, which in turn facilitated the Soviet descent into Stalinist authoritarianism, right? So actually, without them, your argument is essentially that we can't understand, the history of the 20th century. The story could have gone another way, right? With so many organized Marxists in the borderlands, and you showed those numbers; they were incredible. I mean, it looks like the two main Polish Marxist parties had almost the same number, also as the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks combined of members at their peak, and then of course the Finnish Social Democracy actually had more members than the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks combined. So that's pretty incredible, and is by itself a reason not to overlook this phenomenon, right? Given those numbers, with so many organized Marxists in the borderlands, socialism could have traveled westward, as indeed the Western bourgeoisie feared that it was going to do. But instead, capitalist powers made inroads into the East with disastrous political results from a democratic socialist perspective. So one of your central interventions in this book, if I understand it, is that after 1905, the borderland Marxist parties mainly went one of two directions. So some of them were sort of unbroken by defeat, or even were in some cases emboldened by their participation in the events of 1905, and either held the revolutionary social democratic line, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Azerbaijan, et cetera, and implemented anti-capitalist governments, or they became even more radical in the case of Finland, as you argue, which had actually been more moderate before 1905. And then others, another bloc, demoralized by 1905, abandoned some of the main precepts of revolutionary social democracy and turned to a more moderate socialism. And this latter group crucially included Ukraine and Poland, very important constituencies, and began to pursue cross-class alliances with bourgeois parties. I liked the quote that I read in your book, Eric. As one Georgian socialist put it, it was like herding a wolf and a goat into the same pen. And they were thus thereafter sort of persuaded to invite foreign militaries into their lands in 1918, and much to the entire revolution's detriment, and so on. So that's an argument on its own for why we should understand this history, is that it has enormous implications and consequences for the Russian Revolution and the way that it panned out. And it's worth pausing here, I think, to sort of restate your definition of revolutionary social democracy, which you say is the main influence on all of the Marxist parties in Imperial Russia up to 1917-18. So here I have a list in front of me of what you say that it stood for. If you were a revolutionary social democrat in the vein of Kautsky, Lenin, you believed that capitalism's socioeconomic dynamics and periodic crises create the necessity and possibility for socialism, that workers of all nationalities have common interests, which are diametrically opposed to the interests of capitalists, that the working class is the main social force with the interest and power to win democracy and overturn capitalism, that the primary task of a socialist party is to promote the class consciousness and independent organization of workers and to merge socialism with the broader workers' movement, that the historic duty of the working class is the conquest of state power, the abolition of private ownership of the means of production, and the establishment of a worldwide classless society, and that political liberty is needed for socialists to effectively organize and educate workers to fulfill this historic mission. Okay, so that's the laundry list of like principles that you carry with you if you're a revolutionary social democrat during this time period. And the Bolsheviks were not the only organization to believe all of this. They were also not the only party to oppose World War I. They were not the only party to lead workers to power in one form or another in 1917 and 18. And so your book is really making a strong case against Bolshevik exceptionalism. And you argue that, in fact, lots of things that were true of the Bolsheviks were also true of other Marxist parties in the Russian Empire, because they were essentially, to paraphrase, they're essentially what happens when you try to enact revolutionary social democracy as defined above under autocratic rule. Revolutionary social democracy is a set of principles which remain the same, but revolutionary social democrats find themselves in a range of circumstances from, complete autocracy to, a limited or low inclusion parliamentary democracy, as you explained. Or in the case of today, there are plenty of people who agree with that laundry list, myself among them, who are operating in an entirely different set of circumstances. Like you said, it's not the same kind of democracy. It's a capitalist democracy, high inclusion, low participation in some cases. But importantly, the Finnish example seems really instructive, because Germany also had a low inclusion parliamentary democracy, as you put it, but the SPD abandoned a lot of those core precepts of revolutionary social democracy in favor of a politics of nationalism, cross-class alliance, a more moderate socialism. So really one of the only examples that we do have of Marxists ever trying to enact revolutionary social democracy under some kind of democratic conditions is the Finnish example. And like I said, as Finland's a low inclusion parliamentary regime, it's not a capitalist democracy. So it's not one-to-one, and we can't simply copy it. We can't rip off their formula the same way that people want to rip off the formula of the Russian Revolution, right? We're not going to swap out one for the other. But it does make it incredibly important to study the Finnish example in particular. And I think all of the borderland imperial examples as well. So there's something else that I want to bring up that you didn't bring up yet, Eric, but it's in your book, and I think it's a strong theme of your book. There's one other major justification, I think, for studying the non-Russian revolutionary social democratic parties and political projects. And it's that these parties were incredibly successful at merging socialism, which is an ideological and political project, with the proletariat, which is a thing that exists, whether it's socialist or not. So contrary to some accounts, which I've certainly read, which really dramatize the conflict between intellectuals and workers in Russia, narrowly or broadly defined, and try to pin certain outcomes on that tension, you actually write that there was really, as you put, this is a quote from your book, that there was a meaningful, effective affinity between Imperial Russia's workers and the social democratic parties that organized to express their interests and aspirations. And you also write that unlike much of the left today, Marxist currents were committed in theory and practice to making their parties as proletarian in composition and leadership as possible. And you also write that on the whole, Marxist parties across the Russian state were remarkably successful in their efforts to merge socialism with the workers' movement. So when I was reading this section of your book, I think it's obvious that there were bitter fights over the role of intellectuals, which doesn't just mean academics. It's kind of a squishy term, but I think maybe it's better in this case defined as people who aren't wage earners, people who aren't sort of classically proletarian, who are coming to socialism through some kind of, they've reasoned it out, or their commitments have led them to a thought process that made them arrive at socialism, hence their designation as intellectuals, right? Some of them were academics, of course. So yeah, there were bitter fights over the role of these people, intellectuals, but it's also worth noting that the intellectuals weren't, as is sometimes stated, automatically and unquestioningly dominant. And that the reason that they weren't is precisely because of the embrace of revolutionary social democracy, which takes as one of its main precepts the political hegemony of the working class and the primacy of the project of class formation, transforming the working class from a class in itself, the proletariat, a thing that simply exists, to a class for itself, a thing that actually pursues its own interests politically. So if anything, you wrote that there's actually a lot of skepticism of intellectuals who were frequently during this time put in a position to defend themselves against charges of elitism. And you wrote that because of that climate, the early socialist intellectuals in Russia were more likely to idealize workers than to disparage them. So if anybody is getting the impression that during this, in this place and time, there was like a strong elitist tendency on the part of intellectuals, I mean, your research kind of sets the record straight on that. As for whether or not intellectuals were more moderate or more radical, I thought that was really interesting. I mean, you said that in some places, like in Ukraine, intellectuals did eventually drift toward moderation. But in other places like Finland, you said that intellectuals were actually the top radicals in many cases, while the leading moderates were in many cases from proletarian backgrounds. So it wasn't necessarily deterministic, right? And sometimes I thought this was interesting that you said that sometimes the debates about the role of intellectuals tended to mirror contemporary identity politics in some crucial ways. And unfortunately, that obscured some, important dynamics, in part because it actually was a bit too deterministic, didn't really map onto reality super well. But for the most part, and this is actually the really crucial point, regardless of those debates and how intense they were, it sounds like in many cases there were really good symbiotic relationships between intellectuals and workers, which were forged through experience working together in class struggle. And the affinities that they built cut against the corrosive tendencies to like automatically demonize intellectuals on the one hand, and to romanticize, to disparage or romanticize workers on the other hand. And you basically show that where workers and intellectuals had, positive relationships and were both focused on proletarian class formation, that's where the revolutionary social democratic parties had the greatest success in rooting those parties in the working class and merging socialism, a political project, with the proletariat. So all of that said, this is my question for you. It's only one question, but it's a big one. And I actually think it's maybe one of the most relevant ones for us today, because of course, if you look at any online outlet that describes DSAs, there's like a string of words that's often used: downwardly mobile, college educated, middle class millennials. See, I've committed it to memory because it's so common. And because a lot of those people, I mean, it's not obvious that everyone, of course, who even fits that description is not coming to socialism through their own self-interest, but it's definitely true that that definition that I sort of gave before of the intellectual as someone who, has maybe a moral objection to the status quo and then follows their reason to the socialist movement. There are plenty of those people involved in the socialist movement today. I'm one of those people, for example. And so I think that this question is really relevant for us. So you write that in an imperial polity deeply divided by social class, it was no small feat to have constructed organizations in which wage earners and intellectuals could collectively collaborate as comrades. And then you also write that in many of these organizations, the class composition generally reflected their proletarian orientation. So great success. How was this accomplished? How was this success accomplished? And what lessons might we take from it today when our task is more or less identical?
That was fantastic. And that was Meagan Day. And now we'll have Lars Lih with a intervention, and then, sorry, that makes it sound very hostile. Lars Lih with a contribution, and then I will make an intervention, and then we'll have Eric respond.
Thanks. And, Eric and I have been talking back and forth for how long? Decade anyway, when I first met him up here in Montreal. And so this is an incredible book, and I'm glad to have played whatever minor role I played in just discussing with all the research. And so I first wanted to say something about my own personal reaction to it, is that it's, as far as my own work is concerned, which is that it's really great to read to see so many of what I've argued turn out to be correct when someone looks at the material, and so that's very encouraging. And I want to say that one of the great things about this book is it makes it readable, so readable, is the many quotes and the many he said this and they said that, and Eric is good at choosing the more eloquent ones and the more illustrative ones. So. And I think that's the way to go. And as I say, it's a broad range. But there's another reason, not only the fact that we agree on so much, but where we disagree, it's because it's based on evidence. He has it because they're complex, difficult historical issues. So not only our agreements but our disagreements are based on the evidence, on the material, and and so I actually have the hope that for once we can have debates about these historical issues that might lead to a conclusion, that might lead to one side convincing the other, or both sides, most likely both sides modifying each other and finding, not a middle ground, but an accurate ground that's based on the thing. So I my hat off to Eric for putting all of this on, Lenin as the object of historical study, or the historical search for the historical Lenin, and search for the historical Bolshevism, and search for the historical Russian Revolution. Okay, so then I wanted to look a little bit at the title, because I was sort of looking at it and just trying to figure out exactly what was meant by it, and that's the question that I'm going to ask. So, of course, for many people, as we're all aware, revolutionary social democracy is like an oxymoron. It's like a contradiction in terms. Social democracy is that which is not revolutionary. So that's the first thing. You're sort of, which I like, is a challenge to people right there at the top. And then, but there's a couple of questions associated with that. I'm going to ask you to talk about the title. And how you arrived at it. And then there's the working class politics across the Russian Empire, 1882-1917. And I just noticed today when I was working on this and looking at it, that you changed the title from the first go around. If you want to say something about that, why you did that, and why this title that you got is the title that you arrived at. And one of my question is, so is revolutionary social democracy, is that something like bigger than the Russian Empire politics? Like this is an example of revolutionary social democracy, which was a movement or something, I think you said in your remarks just now, it's the left wing of the social democracy, international social democracy. So that's a big topic of which we're now having a case study of working of Russian revolutionary democracy, as in across the Russian Empire, or is it more like this is where revolutionary social democracy really flourished? This is the real thing, so along with that, how does this term relate to other terms that you use and that everybody uses? Orthodox Marxism, Marxism of the Second International, and then the terms that are not revolutionary social democracy, like moderate, which I sort of have slight hostility to, because sometimes these guys are not moderate at all, and sometimes they're quite utopian in a sort of, we can solve our problems in a in a cross-class way, in an agreementist is the word I'm using these days, and reformist and so forth. So that's one thing. What is your conception of your whole topic in those terms? And would there be sister volumes like Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics across Western Europe? Would that be, like France, Germany, and so forth? Then, so I of course completely applaud your getting Kautsky into the action there, and I just want to throw in some ways in which talking about him can be complicated, and it would be better if we could, essentially I agree that one of the things that's unified, there was this guy who over there was looked up to by everybody. He wrote very convincingly, and one of the things we have to explain is why so many people looked up to him. Why he was, if he was turned out to be a bad guy, or he collapsed or he caved, why did beforehand, like in Lenin's phrase, Kautsky is a Marxist? But you used the word Kautskiist, and I can't remember now if you mentioned this in your book or not, but of course, one reason why people are confused about that is that Lenin is, starting from 1914, is in the English edition of his works, and I imagine other languages, sort of railing against Kautskism, So if you read anything from Lenin from 1914 on, he's going to be shouting and screaming about Kautskyism. So naturally, so I think it's kind of important to say that the word is Kautskianstva, and it doesn't mean what we would mean Kautskyism. And that, if you can get that across to people, if you can, what he meant was something was what Kautsky stood for after 1914, which was sort of talking big but not acting on it. And so so in a sense, it was an endorsement of what Kautsky stood for earlier. It was an endorsement of what Kautsky's declared principles, but it was a condemnation of Kautsky personally and of a certain kind of politics that people who didn't agree with Kautsky on any issue would still be called. Like, for example, Trotsky was in Lenin's conception a Kautskiist during this time, 1914, 1916. And then also to separate out the fact that Kautsky talked a lot about Russia specifically and was giving advice to the people. And there was a lot of back and forth feedback. And so that's another thing. And finally, when you mentioned that people say, oh, let's go Kautsky, but what do they mean by Kautsky? What do they, are they saying, let's go with the caricature of Kautsky so anyway, there's a lot of complications, just verbal confusion that would get out of the way to help you get to the place where we can talk about that thing in general. And this is partly something about, so Meagan gave a laundry list of revolutionary social democracy. So I'm not sure about this, but I think there was, you missed what I would consider a very, very basic thing. I would call it hegemony, but I realized from reading Eric's book and listening that word means a lot of things. And Meagan used it in a way that's not exactly what I mean. So it's just a word that it's very hard to find. But what I'm talking about is the idea that the workers had a responsibility and a mission almost to lead the non-proletarian, the democratic forces, the quote unquote. In Russia it was the peasantry, but it didn't have to be the peasantry. It's the idea to lead them. They're not socialists. We're not going to make them socialists, but we have a duty to lead them to victory. And I get another one was should have been talking about and did to some extent was the nationalities, and that's so that meaning of hegemony, which I think is like the core, the heart of Bolshevism, and comes from the Kautskian understanding of Marxism and social democracy, is that the socialists are the ones who can lead the democratic revolution, the radical democratic reform, called reform or revolution, better than anybody else, because they're the ones who are committed to going all the way, because they see that democracy is a necessary means to their end. So they're willing to go all the way. So the Bolsheviks themselves, looking back, and said that was why we won, and that's what we are now. We had hegemony, which is the idea of leading the peasants. We got them as an ally. We got them to fight they got them in the Red Army. We got them to support working class rule. So it's not working class rule meaning socialism. It's working class rule meaning a democratic revolution. And the the Russian Revolution can be looked at. And coming out of your book, I almost thought this is the way to look at it, as a hugely democratic revolution under socialist leadership. That's the other way of looking at it. Instead of a socialist revolution that had a lot of democratic things going on, like land of the peasants and nationality liberation, we could reverse the perspectives. And that seems to me what might be what we can connect for today, which is the socialist Marxist, basic Marxist tactic would be to pull forward, to look around for what can be done for leading democratic revolution. Like one of the phrases that was favored back then was democratic revolution to the end, da konca, right? You've run across it. So I think we can do that. I think that's that's we can reconstruction, was not carried to the end. So we can go back to reconstruction and finish it up. That's only a first step, but it's a necessary first step. But the idea here is that only the socialists, only the Marxist socialists, can really lead this, can understand exactly why we have to do that, and lead it to that. That would be the logic that I get out of the Bolshevik thing, and I think your book shows that in action. And if I got anything else I wanted to say there. Okay, well, I could literally talk for hours about all the different issues that I agree and disagree, and I like it. I love this part, and well, you sure about this and everything? Because what Eric has done has gone back, and he's given life to this material. These are real people in real situations. They're facing, and as he said in his remarks, what the real drama here, and something that Kautsky and the Bolsheviks and other Russian revolutionaries were working out together, and the intellectuals and the workers, as Meagan was saying, they're all working out together, is trying to apply these basic principles to the changing realities. And I would stress the continuity, but the continuity comes out from the fact that they were applying basic principles to a changing situation. And that's how I look at 17. And Eric a little bit stresses the need to adjust, and I agree with that. But it's the sort of continuity of applying the principles and asking the kinds of questions. What are the moving forces, they used to call it, the active forces? What are the class forces for and against? What can we hope to accomplish? What's the international context? Those are the basic questions they applied, and it's those methodological things that are still relevant for today. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Lars. I think Lars and Meagan brought up so many points. It'd be great to have Eric respond. So I will improvise and just give a very the remarks I was going to initially give, but instead a somewhat improvised questions we could get quicker to Eric, which is, I don't think that books like this need to necessarily have a contemporary takeaway that's explicit to be of tremendous value to us. And just in general, a better historical understanding can't help but improve our ability to know what to do today, or just improve our activism. But I think Eric did a great job in his talk touching on the difference not only between the 1917 revolutions and today, but also even the Finnish and German period of revolutionary social democracy and today. But it seems to me that by even drawing comparisons in a loose way, not in a direct one-to-one way between, let's say, the cases of Finland and Germany and today, we might risk a underestimation of how different this period is, just at the level of when we think about all of the politics that emerged out of the Second International, from the politics that became the politics of social democracy in places like Sweden, contemporary social democracy or golden age social democracy, and the politics that became revolutionary socialism in the Russian case. These were politics that came out of a very unsettled period of working class formation. So in a place like Sweden, you have a relatively late industrializer, you have a working class locked out of politics and the need to build a party to both fight for democracy and fight for some basic representation for this new emerging class. Something very similar happens in Finland. And since then, obviously the same thing happens in Germany. We've seen pretty much a secular decline of class voting, class organization, and all its forms. So I guess I'm wondering what Eric would say to someone who doesn't even want to make the more, I think, the safer connection between, let's say, the Finnish parliamentary road and the tasks of democratic socialists today. Someone who looks at at our situation and says, well, we're trying to do the politics of class reformation, but class reformation might have a politics that's entirely unrecognizable from the politics that made sense in that initial phase of class formation. And that might cause us to wonder whether the centering of the working class in the same exact way that we did in the late 19th and early 20th century, whether that makes as much sense in this new political environment, even though, of course, the working class is still a majority. And then obviously in the global South as well, we've seen a kind of unusual developmental trajectory in countries like India, where you have the persistence of informal economies, you have very different forms of political articulation, and you're not having the same development of class-based working class politics, much less mass socialist working class politics. So, and I should say, I do not endorse these heresies. I just figured I would provoke Eric by putting them forward. And we'll have a response from Eric. And then we did get some good questions from the audience. So we'll have around 2 or 3 questions if we have time that we could pose to Eric as well when he's done.
Cool. Yeah, so thank you for all of the really great comments and questions. I'll dig straight in order. So Meagan, how was it accomplished? The first thing I would say, and this maybe actually touches a bit on what Bhaskar asked at the end, is part of the reason they were able to accomplish this merger to the extent they did is that they were hyper focused on making it happen. And so that's not like sufficient, but it is to say that insofar as the left for 40 years or more in many countries has tended to look at the workers' movement as just one good movement amongst many at best, or oftentimes writing it off, well then it's understandable why such a merger wouldn't happen, because it was barely even being attempted. And the hyper focus then of socialists at this time in bringing about this merger between socialism and organized workers, in part was because they were convinced this was true. They hadn't experienced defeats of this project. I think that's a big difference today. This goes again to Bhaskar's question. There wasn't a sense that this had been tried and failed. There was very much a sense that this was working and it's going to keep on working, and it's like up and away, both in Germany and to some extent in Russia as well. And so the extent to which there was a kind of virtuous cycle in which, insofar as more workers got interested in socialism, intellectuals across Europe, and particularly in Russia under autocratic conditions, were just extremely excited about this possibility to which the working class would not only overthrow Tsarism, but potentially overthrow the international capitalist system. And so I think that the short version is that they tried really hard at making it happen. And they, in the same ways that there's so many debates on the left today over, and I do draw this parallel, over different forms of identity politics. They were obsessed with making parties as working class as possible. So they spent a lot of time trying to recruit workers. They spent inordinate amount of time leafleting different workshops, helping build up workers' capacities once they joined. It was not like just they joined and good luck, but they would consciously try to do political education, leadership development, all the things that I think we are not very good at yet in many places. We've lost the ability to do that for various reasons that we can talk about. I would say that in some ways a positive change is that the level of space between intellectuals socially and the working class today is much reduced. It's not that there's not a difference, but we're talking like someone like Lenin was really upper class, or Trotsky maybe a little bit less so. But some of these people were gentry, really like literally landlords. These are people whose family were exploiting the people they were trying to organize, or the peasants. That is not the case for your average DSA, or is not, at this point exploiting workers. And so the space then potentially for a more fruitful kind of convergence, I think, is there. And the difficulties, I think, in large part have to do with accumulated defeats and changes in class structure that have made it hard everywhere in the world, and not just in the United States, for the socialist movement to move beyond the college educated. And so that's a broader conversation. But I think in some ways, we actually have fragments of the working class involved today. And one of the commonalities, I think, with this period is actually that it tended to be then and still today the most privileged sectors of the working class that had the most free time, most education, that tended to lead at moments other than revolutions. And that you could argue that that's maybe what's happening also again with nurses and teachers today, that class fragment has a somewhat similar role as skilled artisans or highly skilled factory workers back in the day. So I'm going to try to breeze through some. Lars, there's so many good questions you asked. I'm going to just have to touch on a few of them. One is the question of revolutionary social democracy. Partly, I just like the title. You know, it's provocative, as you mentioned. But you know, it's a generic term for orthodox Marxism. It was the left of the Second International. I would consider it synonymous basically with like democratic socialism today. If you're like a Marxist who believes that we should focus on class formation and that the process of getting to socialism passes through expanding and leaning upon universal suffrage, electing a workers' party through universal suffrage to government, and that pushing towards some sort of eventual rupture with the capitalist class, that was a core aspect of revolutionary social democracy in the same way as it is for democratic socialism. And then you're right, that's a very broad theory that then had to get implemented in different places. I think the unique dynamic in Imperial Russia is that you had parties actually trying to implement this theory. In Germany, and I have a lot of comparison with Germany, in Germany, Kautsky was writing about this stuff, but by at least 1905 onwards, the leadership of the party were deeply bureaucratized, sort of practicos who didn't care about what Kautsky was saying and mostly ignored it. And so if you want to look at what I don't like the term Kautskism. I don't actually use it in the book. That's why I use it in scare quotes. But if you look at people trying to implement revolutionary social democracy, it's really mostly in the Russian Empire where you can see that happening in practice. And so that's why it's your best test case to see not just what it said in theory, but what it looked like in practice, both in underground conditions and in parliamentary conditions. Because in Finland, and I probably should have stressed this more in the introduction, in 1916, the Finnish parliament, the Finnish social democracy wins, for the first time in world history, the socialists win in the whole world, a parliamentary majority. It's on the basis of that majority that they push for democratizing the state and anti-capitalist politics that leads to a revolution in 1918. And so that shows this non-insurrectionary strategy, its viability. And that's, I think, one of the big arguments of the book. And this goes to the question of, what's relevant. I think the big takeaway that I'm trying to argue there, as far as the Finnish relevance, doesn't go beyond that. It says that the Finnish case shows that we should expect, in conditions of the existence of a parliamentary regime of political freedom, that whatever viability there is of a path towards socialism is going to pass through leaning on and extending those forms of democratic representation, not abrogating them in the name of fighting for some sort of dual power or workers' councils. There's no reason to believe that that will ever gain traction amongst a broad enough sector of the working class that you could win a majority in a capitalist democracy to something like a Leninist orientation in its, at least in its hardest forms and the way it's mostly articulated. So that, I think, is relevant. That's sort of the basic democratic socialist contour. Beyond that, I agree. I mean, I really agree. I don't think that the strategies and tactics of the Finns or the German SPD are particularly relevant. And that's what I was trying to get at. Beyond their attempts to, I'll say, I want to nuance that. I think some of what's relevant is still an attempt to build class consciousness. What is still relevant is what Lars talked about, is the view of the working class, the independent working class, as being the hegemonic force for democracy and for the fights of all the oppressed. So the book does talk about the way these parties fought for national liberation. I've written about that a lot elsewhere, which is why I didn't get into it in the book as much. Also for women's liberation and women's equality, for the fights of peasants. But this idea of the working class as the bearer of the fight for democracy is an aspect of the Finnish experience and of like Kautskyism in quotes that seems to me extremely relevant still. The difficulty is the strategies and tactics beyond that are going to look very different when parliamentary rule is more meaningful. And it is, even in the United States, where it's oftentimes feels extremely unmeaningful, it's still qualitatively different than Germany, where like the emperor could arbitrarily just veto anything. The parliament had very little popular traction for that reason, so it made sense that you would just focus on the final goal. I don't think in a place like the United States or most capitalist democracy across the world today, you can afford to like not intervene within the state to the same extent that the revolutionary social democrats did in Germany. And that has huge implications, because it means you have to learn to like be a socialist leading a capitalist democracy in some sort of transitional periods, or even in a period of like social democratic rule. There's all of these dilemmas that flow from trying to be a Marxist in a capitalist democracy that the Germans just didn't have to face, and the Finns didn't have to face to the same extent, because liberalism was so weak, because the parliamentary regime was so restricted. And so I do think that, and I try to go into that in the book, that poses the question that we don't have a formula. Insofar as there's experiences, we can learn from those. And it means that we also have to learn from experiences. And I try to touch on this, of like the Swedish social democracy, as Bhaskar mentioned, as forms of approximating a move towards mass working class power in the direction of economic democracy, but in conditions of actual capitalist democracy in a welfare state. So I don't think, I would say that like revolutionary social democracy in the Second International is a very important starting point. It's full of lessons, but it's not the final word.
All right, that's great. So what I'll do now is I will pose 3 questions from the audience, and if anyone else, if Lars or Meagan, if you want to jump in, please jump in. Then I'll let Eric conclude. But these are big questions, so maybe I should even pose them together. But anyway, I will all at once. The first one is from Parker, which is, what criteria differentiates capitalist democracies from low inclusion? Lars has shown that the RSDLP was consciously implementing the strategy of the SPD electoral opposition. The center, and not at Luxembourg's mass strikist left, what makes Russians particularly exceptional? Sorry, do you want me to reparse that a little bit, or does that?
Yeah, can you just restate the question, and then I'll.
Okay. So basically, what made if the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was consciously implementing the SPD strategy, the strategy of the center of the SPD, and not Rosa Luxemburg's left of the SPD, the mass strike kind of orientation, what makes Russians particularly exceptional?
Yeah, so there's a couple really basic things that make the Russian context different. One is the absence of political freedom. This is accepting Finland. Finland is a test case, but if we're just saying the rest of the empire, you had to basically be underground as a party. There was limited forms of legal workers organizations. There was moments where you could have like legal Marxist journals, and this was part of the debate. Is some of the moderate socialists thought you could push these further, and that Russia would transform more in the direction of like a Germany without a revolution, or maybe with a revolutionary movement pushing it. In any case, it never got there. It never became a qualitatively different type of regime in which basic political liberties were secured, in which workers' organizations were secured. Workers' organizations sometimes existed, but were often shut down. Unions were shut down. Parties, people were consistently arrested. So there's just a really basic absence of political freedom. And then the parliament that existed, the Duma from 1905 onwards, was, everybody knew it was a sham parliament. Not only did it lack universal suffrage, but basically the Tsar could just dissolve it whenever. If it tried to do anything that he didn't like, well, tough luck. it's gone. So it didn't have any significant legitimacy in the population, which is why the Bolsheviks used it, not wrongly, mostly just as kind of a platform to get their ideas out. And part of the problem, I think, with the left is extrapolating that experience to places where parliament really actually can pass meaningful laws and which it has more legitimacy. And so that to me seems like a pretty significant difference.
Okay. From Fred, do we include Rosa Luxemburg as a revolutionary social democrat in this period? And if so, how do we account for her disagreements with Kautsky?
With Trotsky or with Lenin?
Kautsky.
Oh, Kautsky, sorry.
Yeah.
I'll go, and then Lars and Bhaskar, you should also jump in. Obviously, my 2 cents is yes, 100%, very much a revolutionary social democrat. Definitely. She was consciously together, like with Kautsky, really hand in hand up through at least 1910. In some ways, a bit after, but at least through that whole period, they were the main spokespeople for the left. And the differences came afterwards when Kautsky, after 1910, starts making a shift to the right, and Luxemburg also eventually makes a shift in other directions as well. So I think that the very much in agreement as far as the orientation in Germany and in Russia. And one of the things I would say, though, is it's a big theme of the book, and we can talk about it maybe in another direction, is Rosa Luxemburg. It's actually a very big part of the book, and we haven't talked about it. But Rosa Luxemburg's party did a very poor job, extremely poor job. And Rosa Luxemburg, there's a tendency to romanticize her. One of the things the book tries to do is like, well, actually, the party that Rosa Luxemburg led in Poland had all of the worst attributes that people sort of project onto Bolshevism, minus some of its best parts, which is that it succeeded in leading a revolution. And so people really need to look at Luxemburg in Poland if we're going to have a rounded view of, I think, some of her pretty significant limitations, which weren't actually centered necessarily even on the national question per se, but it had to do a lot more with just like a hyper-sectarian factionalism that led to all sorts of terrible internal and external orientations. Lars or Bhaskar, do you want to jump in on the Rosa question?
Yeah, let me just say that a couple of footnotey things. First of all, they got to be careful with the word center because it changed meaning over the time here. And for example, well, I don't want to go into it, but you got to be careful about that use of the word, which only began to be used as opportunist, revolutionary, and then the center only around this time, 1910, and it was not. So not to what, as you said, they were the two main spokesmen, and they basically agreed on orientation, and they were the people that people looked up to, along with, I should mention, Parvus, Jules Gued in France, and Paul Lafargue, and people. We should get a list. We should get a greater list of the people who were looked up to by revolutionists, and then I just want to say one thing about the Russian, the Bolsheviks were upset by this debate, by this falling out between two of their heroes, but the Mensheviks were sort of gleeful around circa 1910. They said, ha ha ha, you guys are fighting, and because I think this should also be a well-known fact, but it isn't, which is that everybody knew that Kautsky was the mentor of the Bolsheviks in particular after 1905. That in the main disputes, his orientation was the Bolshevik orientation. They said, ha ha ha, Mensheviks, and the Mensheviks sort of said, well, Kautsky's a little off. That is to say, in the Menshevik-Bolshevik divide, Kautsky was clearly on the Bolshevik side during these disputes. So the Bolsheviks 1910, so thought the dispute was saying, okay, when both sides agree that if we have a revolutionary situation, we should do these various things. We should be more radical. We should not do the old, what you call the tried and true tactic. But are we in a revolutionary situation in Germany? And so one guy said, they argued, Kautsky and Luxemburg are fighting about whether we should start the revolution today or tomorrow. Because Kautsky was also saying we're on the verge of a socialist revolution. It's going to come. People are getting more radical and so forth. So the dispute is that dispute is, I think, way fetishized. It's sort of turned into something more basic than it was.
I think that was a great intervention. Eric, do you have a reply or should I move on? Okay, great. All right, so if we're okay to go a little bit longer, there's a couple more questions I'll try to get to, and we'll do maybe a hard stop in 15 minutes, if that's okay. So I should say to the audience that Meagan Day unfortunately just had to leave a couple of minutes ago, but obviously we thank her for her contribution. I guess we're thanking her just in case she decides to relive the glory of this panel one day and watches it archived on YouTube.
But you can say something really mean just in case.
Yeah, right. Just as a test. Okay, so I'll give two questions at once because one I think one's a provocative question from John, which is because I know he has a very strong opinion about this, but what about the Mensheviks? Are they revolutionary social democrats in 1917? Then there's another question from Lucas, which is, Eric, do any elements of Bolshevism explain its success relative to rival borderland revolutionary social democratic parties? Or is it, in your view, that this question itself is misguided?
Oh, wow. Those are really good questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what about the Mensheviks? The Mensheviks were certainly revolutionary social democrats up through 1907. And I think probably in their conception, in their self-conception, they probably consider themselves revolutionary social democrats up through the end, you know, and so I think we should be fair to them that Menshevism was like a very heterogeneous category. So if you look at someone like Martov, there's not that much space between Martov's politics for a lot of this time and like what you might consider the right wing of the Bolsheviks. So it's complicated, but the short version I do think is that when it comes to the specific question of what the revolutionary social democratic orientation was to Russia, the Bolsheviks were orthodox and stuck with it, and the Mensheviks were the innovators who broke with it. This is really the big debate, and in that sense, they weren't revolutionary social democrats. In 1917, the debate had nothing to do with like parliament versus workers' councils. A lot of stuff that people talk about today just wasn't what was debated. The big debate, as Lars has talked about, and that's certainly the case throughout the empire, and it's what you see when you read the documents, was basically, do we make an alliance with liberals in government, or do we break with them and form some sort of workers and peasants regime that will meet the demands of the people and spark the international revolution? So the debate everything centered on, do you break with the representatives of the capitalist class or not? And the Mensheviks said, no, do not break with them. We need them. And we should say it wasn't primarily because they had a wrong theory. The main thing is they didn't want a civil war. To me, like that's actually, you know, it's like, well, you can understand that wasn't a crazy thought. They didn't really want a lot of people to get engulfed in a horrible civil war, and they were scared of that, and they were worried that democracy would get subsumed. And in some sense, they were right. The problem is that their orientation didn't lead anywhere. It also didn't lead to more democracy or anything for that matter, because the liberals were very weak. And so the Mensheviks really did break with the core precept of Russia, revolutionary social democracy for Russia, which was the hegemony of the proletariat, that the workers need to break with the liberals and lead the revolution. And the Mensheviks decidedly broke with that in 1917, and we're really moving away from that from like 1906 onwards. So that's my answer on that. What about the Bolsheviks that made them more successful than other parties in the empire? You know, it's a little bit, I wouldn't necessarily frame it that way, because what you see is in some ways what we call the Bolshevik Party in 1917 becomes just a catch-all party for all of the revolutionary social democrats. So like the Latvian party doesn't formally join the Bolsheviks until like mid-1917. It was its own party. They were doing their own thing. They were hardcore Orthodox revolutionary social democrats, and they were more successful than the Bolsheviks. They literally were so popular that they could have won a majority. They literally did win a majority when there was majority elections, not just in the Soviets, but just for the population as a whole. And then they could choose. They're like, oh, do we want to base our workers' rule on like universal suffrage or workers' councils? And they're like, well, I guess workers' councils. And so, you know, they had this level of success actually that surpassed the Bolsheviks in Central Russia. So I don't think we should assume that it was just the Bolsheviks that took power, or that they were more successful per se. The thing that really set the Bolsheviks apart in 1917 is that it did make a big difference to be in the capital. You know, it gives them, it's not for nothing, particularly by 1917, in which war production gets shifted pretty significantly during the war to the center. The politics of the empire becomes much more concentrated at that moment in the capital. And so what happens there has a disproportionate weight on the rest of the empire in 1917 compared to 1905, in which actually the periphery was more of a vanguard of the revolution than the capital. And then the center of gravity very quickly after October Revolution shifts back to the periphery, because all of the fight in the Civil War really becomes about whether the revolution can spread westward or not. And so the real center of action then becomes Poland, Ukraine, places like that, particularly after October. And I would just again say, you can look at the Finns, it's just the last example. The Finns, in some ways, were more successful in the sense of their popular rootedness, and that they were defeated had not that much to do with their like limitations in politics, but they had the unfortunate luck of being invaded by Germany and being extremely close to Germany and getting killed. And there's the Bolsheviks unfortunately didn't have the ability to kind of like fulfill their promises to give arms to the Finns. And so you can't really read off the defeat of the Finnish Revolution, as some people do, from problems in their strategy. Sometimes you just don't have the forces to defeat your enemies, and that was one of these examples. They were a small place. They didn't have enough ability to defeat an invading German army combined with a white counter-revolution.
So, quick question that will expose some by ignorance, but would you say that the Democratic Republic of Georgia is a fair microcosm for what the Menshevik solution was? And in that case, like, were they primarily advocating cross-class alliances or class collaborationism, like however you want to put it, out of political fear, or just like a vision of their an awareness of their inability to actually enact an alternative political economy, or is it just a completely different thing because of the particularities of Georgia during those 2-3 years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think Georgia is more of a particular thing, and there's a good article actually making this case by Ron Sunni, in which he sort of systematically compares Georgia, and the thing that sets Georgia apart is its relative lower class antagonisms. Industry was less developed. You don't have a strong bourgeoisie. There was never an equivalent depth of the Civil War there, and so the space for a different orientation was greater in Georgia. But I would actually, I think it's important to bracket that, because there's a tendency to romanticize a bit the Georgian experience. And I actually include that in my outcomes as one of the examples of cross-class government, because in a lot of places, including Georgia, what the moderate socialists end up choosing is, insofar as they don't want to break with the capitalist class and do something like workers and peasants rule, they either can try to form an alliance with local liberals, but in the borderlands, the local liberals were often sometimes so weak that the only place they could look was foreign governments. And so I do count as basically cross-class government, moderate socialist governments that were propped up and deeply allied with foreign capitalist regimes. And that was very much the case in Georgia. They made a choice not to ally with workers and peasants rule in Russia, and instead ally with the Germans and then the British state. And so that in turn confirms an aspect of the Menshevik strategy, which was still like a desire and an orientation to some sort of alliance. In the context of Georgia, because it was peripheral, it was not central to the dynamics, they were able to go further than maybe it was possible in central Russia, in which there was less space for some sort of middle road. But I think that's a good question. And the Georgian Social Democrats, I think, should get, I think that they were very successful. And in some ways, as democratic socialists, we have a lot to learn from their example as well. And so we shouldn't dismiss them. But I don't think that their orientation was true in a core sense to revolutionary social democracy. The idea of like having an alliance with a foreign capitalist government is like pretty no as far as that type of orientation.
Yeah, and they ran into a lot of the same economic problems too, massive food shortages in the cities and whatnot. So you could imagine if that kind of orientation was taken at the empire-wide level, they would have either had to make maybe some of the same harsh decisions of the Bolsheviks or just collapse more likely. But Lars, I should let you reply to any of that.
Well, just continue on what you were saying, that there's another orientation. It's state power. It's the Vlast is the Russian word is, but and that's partly, Eric, you mentioned the industry of the capitals. You're totally right. The Bolsheviks were there in the capitals, but one reason that was important was that's where the basic question was going to be decided. Who was going to have the state power at the center, or whether there was going to be a center at all. And the Tsarist, there used to be the Tsar, and then he vanished, so that there's a big void that maybe Marxist theory up to that point really hadn't thought about too much. In fact, nobody had, liberal and so forth, which is how do you deal with that? You have to go back to Thomas Hobbes, which I think is a really good idea. And then I think, so what Bhaskar says is that people face the same problems of just holding on to power. That's the first thing you got to do, and to do that in a place where it's falling apart, and there's going to be shortages, and there's going to be conflict, and there's going to be incompetence and misrule, and there's going to be thuggery at the local level, and this and that and the other thing. Anything that could go wrong did. So I cut enormous slack to any government in that period. We've got to walk a mile in their shoes, to use a cliche. That's all.
Okay, so I guess Eric, if you have anything else to add, if not, then I'll end with a final plug for the book. But
I feel like I've spoken a lot. I will let you finalize.
Okay.
I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been on here. I really look forward to having you actually get a chance to read the book, and I'd love to know what you think. So reach out to me.
So it was really it's a fantastic book. Eric I think most people I know who would write a book like this would talk a lot about the backstory of how they engage with it, all to humbly brag about the linguistic and research efforts it took to do it. But Eric is kind of downplaying how long it took him, and it really comes across. For everyone watching still, I just posted a link again to the June 2022, I think, paperback pre-order from Haymarket Books, which is very affordable and deeply discounted if you do indeed pre-order. So please get yourself a copy of the book. And I should say that the book is dedicated to Leo Panitch, who got the chance to read the book before he unfortunately passed away last December. And he wrote a very nice blurb for it. So if you don't mind, I'll just end with this blurb from Leo Panitch, and of course, also thanking Lars and Meagan for being on the panel as well. And Leo wrote about the book. He said, through impressive research and erudite argumentation, this monumental study of the broad array of revolutionary social democratic parties that operated in the non-Russian borderlands of the Tsarist Empire in the years leading to 1917 definitively shows why there was no one-size-fits-all revolutionary practice, and why there is no reason to overgeneralize the international relevance of the form taken by the October Revolution, a tour de force which provides strong historical foundations for all those today working to develop an anti-capitalist, democratic, socialist political strategy for renewed working class formation and state transformation. So with that, I'll end it. Leo Panich was a fan of this work. I'm a fan of this work. I think many people, when you get the chance to read this over the next year, and hopefully when Eric gets a chance to do some in-person talks developing the many different threads of this book,